Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, Mr. Butterhead. What are we doing?
Well, we're going to hop across the pond a little bit here, because officially after this airs, the very following day, is a rather interesting event that happened in London, in the Whitechapel district, involving a fellow that we all know as Jack the Ripper. He's an unidentified serial killer active in and around the area in 1888. In both criminal case files and the contemporaneous journalistic accounts, the killer was also called the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron.
I heard that one.
Yeah. Now, ascribed to Jack the Ripper typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived and worked in the slums of the East End of London. Their throats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations. Their removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims led to speculation that their killer had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. Rumors that the murders were connected intensified in September of October of 1888, and numerous letters were received by media outlets in Scotland Yard from individuals purporting to be the murderer. The name Jack the Ripper originated in the Dear Boss letter, written by an individual claiming to be the murderer, which was disseminated in the press. The letter is widely believed to have been a hoax and may have been written by journalists to heighten interest in the story and increase the newspaper circulation. The From Hell letter, received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, came with half a preserved human kidney purportedly taken from one of the victims. The public came increasingly to believe the existence of a single serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, mainly because of both the extraordinary brutal nature of the murders and the media coverage of the crimes. Now, extensive newspaper coverage bestowed widespread and enduring international notoriety on the Ripper, and the legend solidified. A police investigation into a series of 11 brutal murders committed in Whitechapel and Spitalfields between 1888 and 1891 was unable to connect all of the killings conclusively to the murders of 1888. Now, 5 victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Indows, and Mary Jane Kelly, are known as the Canonical Five, and their murders between the 31st of August and 9th of November 1888 are often considered the most likely to be linked. The murders were never solved, and the legends surrounding these crimes became a combination of historical research, folklore, and pseudo-history, capturing the public imagination to the present day. Now, Wayback Machine.
Whee!
In the mid-19th century, England experienced an influx of Irish immigrants who swelled the populations of the major cities, including the East End of London. From 1882, Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire and other areas of Eastern Europe immigrated into the same area. Now, the parish of Whitechapel in the East End became increasingly overcrowded, with the population increasing to approximately 80,000 inhabitants by 1888.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Work and the housing conditions worsened, and a significant economic underclass developed. 55% of children born in the East End died before they were 5. Robbery, violence, and alcoholic dependency were commonplace, and the endemic poverty drove many women to prostitution to survive on a daily basis. In 1888, London's Metropolitan Police Service estimated that there were 62 brothels.
Well then.
And 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel, with approximately 8,500 people residing in the 233 common lodge houses in Whitechapel every night. And the nightly price for a coffin bed, what a name for a bed,
A wonderful name.
being 4 pence, and the cost of sleeping upon a lean-to or hangover rope stretched across the dormitory being 2 pence per person. Now, the economic problems in Whitechapel were accompanied by the steady rise of social tensions. Between 1886 and 1889, Frequent demonstrations led to police intervention and public unrest, such as Bloody Sunday in 1887. Anti-Semitism, crime, nativism, racism, social disturbances, and severe deprivation influenced the public perceptions that Whitechapel was a notorious den of immorality.
Ooh.
And such perceptions were strengthened in 1888 when the series of vicious and grotesque murders attributed to Jack received the unprecedented coverage in the media. Like, what else sells paper but gore?
Great.
Now, the large number of attacks against women in the East End during this time adds to the uncertainty of how many victims were murdered by the same individual. Again, 11 separate murders stretching from the 3rd of April, 1888 to the 13th of February, 1891 were included in the Metropolitan Police investigation, were known collectively as in the police docket as the Whitechapel murders. Opinions vary as to whether these murders should be linked to the same culprit, or 5 of the 11 Whitechapel murders, known as the Canonical Five, were widely believed to be the work of the Ripper. Most experts point to the deep slash wounds to the throat, followed by extensive abdominal and genital area mutilation, the removal of internal organs, and progressive facial mutilations as the distinctive feature of Ripper. Now, the first 2 cases in the Whitechapel murders file, those of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram, are not included in the Canonical Five. Smith was robbed and sexually assaulted in the Osborne Street area of Whitechapel, approximately 1:30 a.m. on the 3rd of April, 1888. She had been bludgeoned about the face and received a cut to her ear, a blunt object also inserted into her, rupturing her perineum. She developed peritonitis and died the following day at a London hospital. Smith stated that she had been attacked by 2 or 3 men. One of them was described as a teenager. This attack was linked to later murders by the press, but most authors attribute Smith's murder to the general East End gang violence unrelated to the Ripper case. Now, Tabram was murdered on a staircase landing in George Yard, Whitechapel, on the 7th of August, 1888. She suffered 39 stab wounds.
Ooh, that's just a few.
Yeah, to throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen. Somebody is really detailed in where they're going to stab you. Additional knife wounds inflicted on the breast and vagina. All but one of Tabram's wounds had been inflicted with a bladed instrument, such as a penknife, and with one possible exception, all the wounds had been inflicted by a right-handed individual. Tabram had not been raped. The savagery of the Tabram murder, though, the lack of an obvious motive, and the closeness of the location and date to the later Canonical Ripper murders, led police to link this murder to those later committed by Jack the Ripper. However, this murder differs from the later Canonical murders because although Tabram had been repeatedly stabbed, she had not suffered any slash wounds to the throat or abdomen. Many experts do not connect Tabram's murder with the later murders because of this difference in the wound pattern. Now, the Canonical Five, again, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Indows, and Mary Jane Kelly. The body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered around 3:40 a.m. on Friday the 31st, August 1888, in Bucks Row, now Durward Street, in Whitechapel. Nichols had been seen alive approximately 1 hour before the discovery of her body by a Mrs. Emily Holland, whom with she had previously shared a bed at the Common Lodge housing on Thrall Street, Spitalfields, walking in the direction of Whitechapel Road. Her throat was severed with 2 deep cuts, one of which completely severed the tissue down to the vertebra. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen was partially ripped open by a deep, jagged wound, causing her bowels to protrude.
Man.
Yeah, it sounds like somebody needs to have a. They need a better hobby. Several other incisions inflicted to both sides of the abdomen, also caused by the same knife, and each of these wounds had been inflicted in a downward thrusting manner. 1 week later, on the 8th of September, a Saturday in 1888, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered, approximately about 6 a.m., near the steps of the doorway on the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. As in the case of Nichols, the throat was severed by 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been cut completely open, with a section of the flesh from her stomach being placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, plus small intestines, being removed and placed on her right shoulder. Chapman's autopsy also revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had been removed. At the inquest into Chapman's murder, Elizabeth Long described having seen Chapman standing outside 29 Hanbury Street about 5:30 a.m. in the company of a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker hat and dark overcoat and of a shabby genteel appearance. According to the eyewitness, the man had asked Chapman the question, "Will you?" and which Chapman had replied, "Yes." Now, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Oudis were both killed in the early morning hours of Sunday the 30th of September in 1888. Stride's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. in Duffield's yard off Berners Street, now Henrique Street in Whitechapel. Cause of death was a single clear-cut incision measuring 6 inches across her neck, which had severed her right carotid artery and trachea before terminating beneath her right jaw. The absence of any further mutilations to her body has led to uncertainty whether Stride's murder was committed by the Ripper or whether he was interrupted during the attack. I'm thinking interrupted.
Sounds most likely.
Because he did the first slash, he didn't get a chance to do any more handiwork. Several witnesses later informed police that they had seen Stride in the company of a man or close to Berners Street on the evening of the 29th of September, the early hours of the 30th, but each gave different descriptions. Some said the companion was a fair, others dark. Some said he was shabbily dressed, others said well-dressed. Now, Endow's body was found in a corner of Mitchery Square in the city of London 3/4 of an hour after the discovery of the body of Elizabeth Stride. Now, her throat was severed from ear to ear and her abdomen ripped open by a long, deep, and jagged wound before her intestines had been placed over her right shoulder, and a section of intestine being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. The left kidney and a major part of Endo's uterus had been removed, and her face had been disfigured, with her nose severed, her cheeks slashed, and cuts measuring 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch, respectively, vertically incised through each of her eyelids.
Fun.
A triangular incision, the apex of which pointed towards Endo's eye, had also been carved into each of her cheeks, and a section of the auricle and lobe of her right ear were later recovered from her clothing.
Fun.
Yeah. The police surgeon who conducted the post-mortem upon Endo's body stated his opinion these mutilations would have taken at least 5 minutes to complete. No duh. A local cigarette salesman named Joseph Lorande had passed by a narrow walkway to Mitchery Square named Church Passage with two friends shortly before the murder. He later described seeing a fair-haired man of medium build and with a shabby appearance with a woman who may have been Endow's. Landa's companions were unable to confirm the description, and the murders of Stride and Endo's ultimately became known as the double event. A section of Endo's bloody apron were found at the entrance of the tenement on Goulston Street, Whitechapel, at 2:55 a.m. A chalk inscription upon the wall directly above the piece of apron read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffito was known as the Goulston Street graffito, and the message appeared to imply that a Jew or Jews in general were responsible for the series of murders, but it's unclear whether the graffito was written by the murderer on dropping the section of apron or merely incidental and nothing to do with the case. Such graffiti was commonplace in Whitechapel. Police Commissioner Charles Warren feared that the graffito might spark anti-Semitic riots and ordered the writing washed away before dawn. The extensively mutilated and disemboweled body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered lying on a bed in the single room where she lived in 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, Spitalfields, at 10:45 a.m. on Friday, the 9th of November in 1888. Her face had been hacked beyond all recognition, and throat severed down to the spine, and the abdomen almost emptied of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and other viscera from her body placed beside her foot, about the bed, and sections of the abdomen and thighs upon the bedside table. The heart was missing from the crime scene as well. Now, multiple ashes found within the fireplace suggested Kelly's murderer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the single room as he mutilated the body. A recent fire had been severe enough to melt the solder between the kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate of the fireplace. Each of the Canonical 5 murders was perpetrated at night or on close to a weekend, either at the end of the month or a week or so after. The mutilations became increasingly severe as a series of murders proceeded, except for that of Stride, whose attacker may have been interrupted. Nichols was not missing any organs. Chapman's uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina were taken. Andow's had her uterus and left kidney removed and her face mutilated. And Kelly's body was extensively eviscerated, with her face gashed in all directions and the tissue of her neck being severed to the bone, although the heart was the sole body organ missing from this crime scene. Now, historically, the belief of the 5 canonical murderers were committed by the certain perpetrator is derived from the contemporaneous documents which linked them together to the exclusion of others. In 1894, Sir Melville Nagatman, Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police Service and head of the Criminal Investigation Department, wrote a report that stated that the Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims and 5 victims only. Similarly, the canonical 5 victims were linked together in a letter written by the police surgeon Thomas Bond to Robert Anderson, head of the London CID, in the 10th of November of 1888. Now, some researchers have posited that some of the murders were undoubtedly the work of a single killer, but an unknown larger number of killers acting independently were responsible for the other crimes. Authors Stuart P. Evans and Donald Rumbelow argue the canonical 5 is a Ripper myth and that 3 cases, Nichols, Chapman, and Endos, can definitely be linked to the same perpetrator, but they're less certain as to whether Stride and Kelly were also murdered by the same individual. Conversely, others suppose that the 6 murders between Tabram and Kelly were the work of a single killer. Now, Dr. Percy Clark, assistant to the examining pathologist George Bagster Phillips, linked only 3 of the murderers and thought that the others were perpetrated by weak-minded individuals induced to emulate the crime. McAcklin did not join the police force until a year after the murders, and his memorandum contained serious factual errors about possible suspects. Now, after those 5, Mary Jane Kelly is generally considered to be the Ripper's final victim, and it is assumed that the crimes ended because of the culprit's death, imprisonment, institutionalization, or immigration. There is rumors that he might have fled to America. We don't know. The Whitechapel murders file detail another 4 murders that occurred after the canonical 5, those of Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, the Pinchin Street Torso, and Francis Coles. Now, the strangled body of 26-year-old Rose Mylett was found in Clark's Yard, High Street, Poplar, on the 20th of December, 1888. There was no sign of a struggle. The police believe she had either accidentally hanged herself with her collar while in a drunken stupor or committed suicide. However, faint markings left on the cord on one side of her neck suggested she had been strangled. At an inquest of Mylett's death, the jury returned a verdict of murder. Alice Mackenzie was murdered shortly after midnight on the 17th of July, 1889, in Castle Alley, Whitechapel. She had suffered 2 stab wounds to the neck, and her left carotid artery had been severed. Several minor bruises and cuts were found on her body, which also bore a 7-inch long superficial wound extending from her left breast to her navel. One of the examining pathologists, Thomas Bond, believed that the Ripper murder, though his colleague George Bagster Phillips, who examined the bodies of the 3 previous victims, disagreed. Opinions among the writers are also divided among those who suspect Mackenzie's murder might have copied the Jack the Ripper to deflect suspicion from himself, and those who ascribe this murder to Jack the Ripper. Now, the Pinchin Street Torso was a decomposing, headless, and legless torso of an unidentified woman aged between 30 and 40 discovered beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street, Whitechapel, on the 10th of September, 1889. Bruising about the victim's back, hip, and arm indicated that the dead had been extensively beaten shortly before death. The victim's abdomen was also extensively mutilated, although the genitals had not been wounded. She appeared to have been killed approximately 1 day prior to the discovery of her torso. The dismembered sections of the body are believed to have been transported to the railway arch, hidden under an old chemise. 2:15 a.m. on the 13th of February, 1891, P.C. Ernest Thompson discovered a 25-year-old prostitute named Frances Coles lying beneath a railway arch in Swallow Gardens, Whitechapel. Her throat had been deeply cut, and the body was not mutilated, leading some to believe Thompson had disturbed her assailant. Coles was still alive, although she died before medical help could arrive. A 53-year-old stoker, James Thomas Sadler, had early been seen drinking with Coles, and the two are known to have argued approximately 3 hours before her death. Sadler was arrested by the police and charged with her murder. He was briefly thought to have been the Ripper, but later was discharged from court for lack of evidence on the 3rd of March, 1891. Now, in addition to these 11 Whitechapel murders, commentators have also linked other attacks to the Ripper. In the case of Fairy Fay, it is unclear whether this attack was real or fabricated as part of the Ripper lore. Fairy Fay was a nickname given to an unidentified woman whose body was allegedly found in a doorway close to the commercial road on the 26th of December after a stake had been thrust through her abdomen. But there was no recorded murders in Whitechapel on and around the Christmas of 1887. Fairy Fay seems to have been created through a confused press report at the murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith, who had a stick or other blunt object shoved into her unmentionables. Most authors agree that the victim, Fairy Fay, never existed. A 38-year-old widow named Annie Millwood was admitted to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary with numerous stab wounds to her legs and lower torso on the 25th of February, 1888. Informing staff she had been attacked with a clasp knife by an unknown man. She was later discharged but died from apparently natural causes on the 31st of March. Millwood was later postulated to be the Ripper's first victim, although the attacker cannot be definitively linked to this perpetrator. Another suspected pre-canonical victim was a young dressmaker named Ada Wilson, who reportedly survived being attacked and stabbed twice in the neck with a clasp knife upon the doorstep of her home in Bow on the 28th of March, 1888, by a man who had demanded money from her. A further possible victim, a 40-year-old Annie Farmer, resided in the same lodging house as Martha Tabram and reported an attack on her on the 21st of November, 1888. She received a superficial cut to the throat. Although the unknown man with blood on his mouth and hands had run out of this lodging house, shouting, "Look at what she has done!" before two eyewitnesses heard Farmer scream her wounds were light and possibly self-inflicted. And the whitetail mystery was a term coined for the discovery of a headless torso of a woman on October the 2nd, 1888, in the basement of the new Metropolitan Police headquarters being built in Whitehall. An arm and shoulder belonging to the body were previously discovered floating in the River Thames near Pimlico on the 11th of September, and the left leg was subsequently discovered buried near where the torso was found on the 17th of October. The other limbs and head were never recovered, and the body was never identified. These mutilations were similar to those of the Pinchin Street torso case, where the legs and head were severed, but not the arms. Now, both the Whitehall mystery and the Pinchin Street case may have been part of a series of murders known as the Thames Mysteries, committed by a single serial killer dubbed the Torso Killer. It is debatable whether Jack the Ripper and the Torso Killer were the same person or separate serial killers active in the area. I'm going with two separate people.
Me too. The styles are different.
Way too different, yeah. And the modus operandi differed from that of the Ripper, and the police at the time discounted any connection between the two. Only one of the four victims linked to the Torso Killer, Elizabeth Jackson, was ever identified. Jackson was a 24-year-old prostitute from Chelsea whose various body parts were collected from the Thames River over a 3-week period between the 31st of May and the 25th of June, 1889. On the 29th of December, 1888, the body of a 7-year-old boy named John Gill was found in a stable block in Manningham, Bradford. Gill had been missing since the 27th of December. His legs had been severed, abdomen opened, his intestine partially drawn out, his heart and one ear removed. Similarities with the Ripper murders led to press speculation that the Ripper had killed him. The boy's employer, a 23-year-old milkman, Warren Barrett, was twice arrested for the murder, but was released due to insufficient evidence. No one has ever been prosecuted. Carrie Brown, nicknamed Shakespeare, reportedly for her habit of quoting Shakespeare's sonnets, was strangled with her clothing and then mutilated with a knife on the 24th of April, 1891, in New York City. Her body was found with a large tear through her groin area and superficial cuts on her legs and back. No organs were removed from the scene, though an ovary was found upon her bed, either purposely removed or unintentionally dislodged. At the time, the murder was compared to those of Whitechapel, though the Metropolitan Police eventually ruled out any connection. Now, the vast majority of the City of London police files relating to the investigation into the Whitechapel murders were destroyed in the Blitz.
Oops.
The surviving Metropolitan Police files allow a detailed view of the investigation procedures in the Victorian era. A large team of policemen conducted house-to-house inquiries through Whitechapel. Forensic material was collected and examined. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from the inquiry. Modern police work follows the same pattern. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, upwards of 300 people were investigated, and 80 people were detained.
Wow.
Following the murders of Stride and Endos, the commissioner of the City of Police offered a reward of £500 for the arrest of the Ripper. Now, the investigation was initially conducted by the Metropolitan Police Whitechapel Division, Criminal Investigation Department, headed by the detective, Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews were sent from Central Office in Scotland Yard to help. The City of London Police were involved under Detective Inspector James McWilliam after the Endos murder, which occurred in the City of London. The overall direction of the murder inquiries was hampered by the fact that the newly appointed head of the CID, Robert Anderson, was on leave in Switzerland between the 7th of September and the 6th of October, during which time Champlin, Stride, and Endos were killed. This prompted the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, to appoint Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate the inquiry from Scotland Yard. Now, here's where I kind of have some fun, because it says butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, and physicians were suspected because of the matter of the mutilations. When you look at each one of those main cases, somebody had pretty good knowledge of the internal workings of a human being for 1888. I mean, to know exactly where to cut a person, how deep to cut a person, and then start removing individual organs, yeah, I'd be looking at medical. And they were, obviously suspected. A surviving note from Major Henry Smith, acting commissioner of the city police, indicates that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, with the result that they were eliminated from the inquiry. A report of the Inspector Swanson on the Home Office confirms that 76 butchers and slaughterers were visited, and the inquiry encompassed all of their employees for the previous 6 months. Some contemporaneous figures, including Queen Victoria, thought the pattern of murders indicated that the culprit was a butcher or cattle drover on one of the cattle boats that plied between London and mainland Europe. Whitechapel is close to the London docks, and unusually, such boats docked on the Thursday or Friday and then departed Saturday or Sunday. Hop on shore, kill somebody, hop back on the boat, you're off again. Almost sounds like that case that we saw down there in Iowa, because they did wonder about that guy who hopped on the train.
Right.
Now, cattle boats were examined on the dates of the murders, did not coincide with a single boat's movements, and the transfer of crewmen between boats was also ruled out. In September of 1888, a group of volunteer citizens in London's East End formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. They patrolled the streets looking for suspicious characters, partially because of dissatisfaction with the failure of police to apprehend the perpetrator, and also because some members were concerned that the murders were affecting businesses in the area. The committee petitioned the government to raise the reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer, offered its own reward of £50, equivalent to about £5,900 in today money, for information leading to his capture, and hired private detectives to question witnesses independently. In the end of October, Robert Anderson asked police Surgeon Thomas Bond to give his opinion on the extent of the murderer's surgical skill and knowledge. The opinion offered by Bond on the character of the Whitechapel murderer is the earliest surviving offender profile. Bond's assessment was based on the examination of the most extensively mutilated victim and the post-mortem notes from the 4 previous canonical murders. He wrote, "All 5 murderers, no doubt, were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. The last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say in what duration the fatal cut was made, but arterial blood was found on the wall and the splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All of the circumstantial surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the women must have been laying down when murdered, and in every case the throat was first cut." Makes me wonder if they drugged him or something, too.
It would make sense, because...
If they're all lying down.
Yeah.
Bond was strongly opposed to the idea that the murderer possessed any scientific or anatomical knowledge, or even technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. In his opinion, the killer must have been a man of solitary habits, subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania, and the character of the mutilations possibly indicating sidereus. Bond also stated the homicidal impulse may have developed as a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, and that religious mania may have been the likely disease, although he doesn't think either hypothesis is likely. There's no evidence that the perpetrator engaged in sexual activity with any of the victims, yet psychologists suppose the penetration of the victims with a knife and leaving them on display in sexually degrading positions with the wounds exposed indicates the perpetrator derived sexual pleasure from the attacks. This view is challenged by others who dismiss this hypothesis as insupportable supposition. In addition to the contradictions and unreliability of contemporaneous accounts, attempts to identify the murderer has been hampered by the lack of any surviving forensic evidence. DNA analysis of extant letters is inconclusive, and the available material has been handled many times and is too contaminated to provide meaningful results. There have been mutually incompatible claims that DNA evidence points conclusively to 2 different suspects, Aaron Kaminsky, the Whitechapel barber, and artist Walter Sickert. The scientific methodology used to advance both of these claims by the proponents has also been criticized. But the story goes on, and they have, many different topics. Go ahead and pop into the comments. Do you think this fellow escaped to America and then started a whole new life? Do you think he was a victim of his own debauchery and wound up getting killed by a group that didn't realize they had who they had, but he wound up dead anyway? Or did he just die of old age after feeding a weird habit?
Yeah, see, I like the idea of him going to America, but there just isn't enough.
There's enough cases.
Yeah, there aren't enough cases. Because he went to America, unless he wasn't capable of doing the murders anymore, why wouldn't he just keep doing it? Right.
And there are some serial killers that will, act out for, 6 months, a year, and then sink back into the background for, 5 to 6 years, and then pop up again. The BTR killer, if I remember right, that was part of his thing. Is that he acted out for, I think it was like 2 or 3 years, and then vanished, and then they found him when he started acting up again. But anyway, folks, this has been the Bearded Historian. Sue is on the camera, and let us know what you think of your opinion of our Jack the Ripper. And you folks have a good day.